The house that fought back. The salt air tasted like freedom when Margaret first stepped onto the deck of her beach house. At 67, after 4 decades of teaching high school English to indifferent teenagers, she'd finally claimed something entirely her own. The property had consumed most of her retirement savings and the inheritance from her late sister. But standing there with the Atlantic stretching endless before her, she felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. That feeling lasted exactly 11 days. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while she was arranging seashells on the kitchen windowsill, pale pink spirals she'd collected during her dawn walk. Her son's name flashed on the screen, and she answered with genuine warmth. They hadn't spoken much since her move from Ohio to this quiet stretch of North Carolina coast. "Mom, we need to talk about the house. Not, how are you settling in? Not, is the ocean beautiful?" Just that flat statement, delivered in the tone he used to negotiate his tech sales. "What about it, David?" She cradled the phone against her shoulder, still positioning a particularly delicate shell. "You bought a 5-bedroom property for one person. That's not practical. Jennifer and I have been talking, and we've decided to bring the kids down for the summer. Actually, we've already booked the flights. We arrive Friday." The shell slipped from her fingers and shattered against the tile floor. "This Friday? David, I just moved in. I haven't even—" "It's not up for discussion, Mom. The kids need a break. Jennifer's been stressed. And honestly, you rattling around in that big house alone doesn't make sense when we're cramped in our condo. We'll be there for 3 months. Maybe longer if it works out." 3 months. The words hit like a slap. "You can't just decide. We'll talk when we get there. I've got a meeting." The line went dead. Margaret stood in her kitchen, staring at the broken shell fragments. Outside, waves rolled in their eternal rhythm. But the sound had changed. It no longer whispered peace. It roared warning. Friday arrived wrapped in the kind of cruel sunshine that made everything worse. She'd spent 3 days in a fog of disbelief, calling David back repeatedly, reaching only voicemail. She'd told herself he couldn't be serious. This was a misunderstanding. He'd called to apologize, to ask properly, to acknowledge that this was her house, bought with her money, meant for her retirement. The taxi pulled up at 2:15. She watched from the front window as David emerged first, taller than she remembered, wearing expensive sunglasses and that smile he'd perfected in college, the one that said he'd already won whatever argument you thought you were having. Jennifer followed, phone pressed to her ear, designer luggage in her other hand. The twins, Mason and Olivia, exploded from the back seat like champagne corks, screaming about the ocean. Margaret opened the door, attempting something resembling a welcoming expression. "Mom!" David swept past her, barely grazing her shoulder with a one-armed hug. "Place looks great. Where should we put our stuff?" "David, we need to talk about this. You can't just—" "Kids, go explore," Jennifer called out, finally off her phone. She gave Margaret a quick air kiss. "Margaret, you're looking rested. Which rooms are ours?" "That's what I'm trying to explain. I wasn't prepared for—" "Master bedrooms this way, right?" David was already moving down the hall, pulling a suitcase behind him. "We saw the listing photos when you bought it. Great bones on this place. Really great investment." The words stuck like a fishbone in her throat. "That's my bedroom," she said, following him. Her voice sounded thin, elderly. She hated it. David laughed, actually laughed. "Mom, you don't need all that space. There's a perfectly good room at the end of the hall. Smaller, quieter. Better for someone your age, honestly. You'll sleep better without all the ocean noise." Before she could respond, he was in her bedroom, Jennifer beside him, both assessing it with the clinical evaluation of people touring a property they intended to buy. "We'll need to move that armoire. It blocks the natural light flow. And these curtains, Margaret, are these from the 70s? They came with the house. I haven't had time to—" "Don't worry, we brought our own linens. Mason, Olivia, don't track sand inside." Jennifer disappeared back toward the living room. David turned to Margaret with what he probably thought was a patient expression. "Mom, here's the thing. You're not using this space efficiently. Jennifer and I need the master. We're working remotely, and we need the space for our laptops, the good Wi-Fi signal. You understand. I bought this house for my retirement. You can't just move me out of my own bedroom. Something flickered across David's face. For a moment, she thought it might be shame. Then it hardened into something else entirely. Let's not make this difficult, he said quietly. You're getting older. Living alone in a big house, it's not safe. Jennifer and I have been talking about alternatives. Alternatives? Assisted living facilities. Nice ones. Very nice. But expensive. That's why it makes more sense for us to utilize this property properly. Think of it as intergenerational wealth management. He smiled that sales smile again. We're family, Mom. We share resources. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. You're threatening me. I'm being practical. Now, the movers should be here tomorrow with the rest of our things. We'll help you relocate to the smaller room. It'll be cozy. You'll see. He walked past her, leaving her standing in what was no longer her bedroom. The next 72 hours unfolded like a hostile takeover. The movers arrived with boxes labeled Beach House, Living Room, Beach House, Kitchen, Beach House, Master Bath. Jennifer supervised while Margaret watched her carefully chosen furniture, the wicker chair she'd found at an estate sale, the bookshelf she'd refinished herself, get relocated to the garage to make room for Jennifer's modern pieces. This is temporary, Margaret said when Jennifer carried a box of Margaret's books past her. Jennifer didn't even look up from her phone. The kitchen received a complete reorganization. Margaret's modest collection of spices was relegated to a single drawer, while Jennifer installed a coffee station, juicer, and air fryer on the counter. When Margaret reached for her favorite mug the next morning, it was gone. We simplified, Jennifer explained, not explaining at all. You had so much clutter. The children treated the house like a resort where no rules applied. They left wet towels on every surface, scattered toys like landmines, and screamed through the halls at all hours. When Margaret gently suggested they use indoor voices, Mason, 8 years old and already fluent in his parents' entitled disdain, looked her straight in the eye and said, "This is our house now," Dad said. David was always on a call, always busy, always just about to discuss things but never quite getting there. When Margaret cornered him on the deck the fourth evening, he held up one finger in a just a minute gesture that stretched into 15 before he finally acknowledged her. We need to establish some ground rules, she started. Mom, you're being dramatic. We're family. Families don't need contracts and rules. He scrolled through his phone while he spoke. Jennifer and I have been under enormous stress. The market's been brutal. We needed this break, and frankly, you needed the company. You were isolated out here. I chose to be here. I wanted peace and quiet. At your age, isolation leads to cognitive decline. We're actually doing you a favor. He finally looked up, and his eyes were hard. Besides, this house is a family asset now. We need to think about the future, about what happens when you can't manage it anymore. I can manage perfectly well. Can you? Because you're not even using half the space. It's wasteful. Jennifer and I have been talking. This property could be generating income, short-term rentals, Airbnb. We could turn the guest bedrooms into revenue streams while we're here, and when you eventually move to a more appropriate living situation, we could really maximize the potential. This is my house, David. I'm not turning it into a rental. He stood, towering over her now. When had her little boy become this stranger who looked at her like she was an obstacle? I've already contacted a real estate attorney about putting the property in a family trust. For tax purposes, estate planning. It's the smart move. You'll still technically own it, but the decisions will be made collectively, democratically. You mean you'll make them. I mean we'll protect you from making poor choices. You're not young anymore, Mom. Your judgment isn't what it was. That night, relocated to the small back bedroom that smelled of mothballs and faced the alley rather than the ocean, Margaret lay awake listening to Jennifer laugh in her bedroom, in her house. She heard David on yet another work call, his voice booming through walls that suddenly felt paper thin. The sound of waves, which should have soothed her, seemed to whisper a single word over and over: fight. Sunday morning, while her son's family slept off their Saturday beach party, Margaret drove to the only coffee shop open at dawn. Her hands shook slightly as she waited for her latte, not from fear, she realized, but from fury that had finally crystallized into purpose. She'd spent the previous day making calls, gathering information, planning. Teaching for 40 years had taught her many things, but the most valuable lesson came from watching administrators. Power wasn't about being the loudest voice. It was about being the most prepared. The coffee shop Wi-Fi was strong. She opened her laptop and reviewed her notes. First call, Robert Chen, the estate attorney whose number her neighbor had provided. She'd reached him Friday afternoon, outlined the situation in clinical terms. He asked 3 questions, then told her to come to his office Monday morning at 8. His voice had held something she desperately needed to hear: controlled outrage on her behalf. Second call, Patricia Morales, a forensic accountant specializing in elder financial abuse. Patricia had listened to Margaret's summary and said 4 words that made her spine straighten. This is financial exploitation. Third call, the number she'd found on a business card tucked into her sister's old files. Marcus Washington, private investigator. She almost hadn't dialed. It felt dramatic, paranoid. Then she'd overheard David on the phone late Friday night, his voice lowered, but not low enough. Once the trust is established, she won't have legal grounds. If we have to, we can prove diminished capacity. Marcus had asked for 48 hours. I'll look into your son's finances, his business dealings, everything. You'd be surprised what people leave in the digital footprint. The coffee cooled in her hands as she sat in the mostly empty cafe, waves visible through the window, gulls wheeling against a sky going pink with sunrise. For the first time since that phone call 11 days ago, Margaret felt something uncurling in her chest. She wasn't helpless. She was strategic. Monday morning arrived with the kind of beautiful weather that made the entire situation feel so real. How could the world be this lovely while her life was being stolen from her? Margaret left the house at 7:30, telling no one where she was going. David was still asleep. Jennifer was on the deck doing yoga in expensive athleisure wear. The children's cartoons blared from the living room television. Robert Chen's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian in downtown Wilmington. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 50, with kind eyes behind frameless glasses and a handshake that conveyed both respect and determination. "Tell me everything," he said, and she did. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Mrs. Harrison, I want you to understand something clearly. What your son is doing constitutes elder abuse in multiple forms: financial, emotional, potentially legal coercion. The threats about assisted living, the unauthorized occupation of your property, the attempts to establish a trust without your informed consent, these are serious matters. Can he actually do it? The trust? Not legally. Not without your signature and witnessed consent. But," Robert paused, choosing his words carefully, "people in your son's position often rely on their parents not knowing their rights. They bank on fear, on social conditioning about respecting your children, and the parents' unwillingness to create family conflict. He's counting on me being too afraid to fight back?" "Exactly. Which is why I'm going to ask you a difficult question. How far are you willing to go?" Margaret thought of her bedroom, now occupied by strangers who happened to share her DNA. She thought of her books in boxes, her routines shattered, her peace stolen. She thought of Mason's smirk and Jennifer's dismissals, and David's smooth threats wrapped in the language of filial concern. "As far as necessary," she said. Robert smiled. "Good. Then here's what we're going to do." The plan unfolded in stages, each piece clicking into place with satisfying precision. Stage 1. Documentation. Robert sent her home with a detailed list. She was to photograph everything: the rearranged furniture, the boxes of her belongings in the garage, the evidence of their occupation. She was to keep a journal of every conversation, every threat, every dismissal. She was to save every text message and email. "Build the case," Robert said. "Even if we don't go to court, documentation is power." Stage 2. Financial fortification. Patricia Morales helped Margaret establish new accounts in her name only, transfer her direct deposits, and ensure that every asset she owned was clearly, indisputably hers.
They reviewed her will, her power of attorney documents, every legal instrument that could potentially be exploited. You mentioned he talked about getting you declared mentally incompetent, Patricia asked during their Tuesday afternoon meeting. He implied it, said my judgment was failing. Patricia's expression hardened. We're going to get you a complete cognitive evaluation from a certified neuropsychologist. Not because I think you need it, but because when you're declared completely competent, it becomes ammunition against any claims he might make. Stage 3. Intelligence gathering. Marcus Washington called Wednesday evening. Margaret took the call in her car, parked at a beach access point, waves crashing in the darkness beyond. Your instincts were good, Marcus said. Your son's in significant financial trouble. His tech company took heavy losses in the last quarter. He's mortgaged to the gills on the condo, behind on credit card payments, and there's a lawsuit from a former business partner. He needs cash, and he's been researching reverse mortgages on properties he doesn't own. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. He's planning to stay here permanently, to somehow take the house, or force you to sell it and give him the proceeds. I found searches on his laptop. I have a contact at his internet provider for elder care facilities and estate liquidation services. He's been on this path for months. Rage crystallized into something cold and sharp. Send me everything you found. Already encrypted and in your email. Mrs. Harrison, whatever you're planning, make it count. By Thursday, Margaret was ready to execute the final stage. She'd spent the week being the perfect picture of the declining elderly woman David wanted her to be. She'd been forgetful, confused, shuffling through the house in her bathrobe at odd hours. She'd left the stove on once, deliberately. She'd asked the same questions twice. She'd played the role, and David had eaten it up, exchanging meaningful glances with Jennifer, his confidence growing. Thursday afternoon, while the family was at the beach, 3 vehicles pulled up to the house. The first was a commercial cleaning service. 6 people emerged and, under Margaret's direction, began a complete deep clean and reorganization. Every item that belonged to David's family was carefully cataloged, boxed, and loaded into a storage pod that arrived behind them. The second vehicle brought a locksmith. The third was Robert Chen's car. By the time David's family returned at 6, sunburned and sandy, the transformation was complete. The house looked exactly as it had when Margaret first moved in. Better, actually. Professionally cleaned, her furniture back in place, her books on shelves, her favorite mug in the kitchen cupboard. And the locks changed. David's key didn't work. Margaret watched through the window as confusion crossed his face, then annoyance, then something approaching panic. He rang the doorbell repeatedly. She let him ring. Finally, she opened the door, but only wide enough to stand in the frame, blocking entrance. Mom, what the hell? Our key doesn't work. Did you change the locks? I did. This is my house, David. You are not welcome here anymore. His face went through a remarkable series of expressions. You can't be serious. Our stuff is in a climate-controlled storage unit. Here's the key and the address. She handed him an envelope through the gap. The first month is paid. After that, it's your responsibility. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. This is exactly what we've been worried about. Your judgment is perfect. I saw Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a neuropsychologist, yesterday. Full cognitive evaluation. I scored in the top tier for my age group. The report is here if you'd like to see it. She held up a folder, along with documentation of your financial situation, your plans to establish a trust without my informed consent, your research into selling my property, and your attempts to coerce me through threats of institutionalization. David's face went white. Who told you? It doesn't matter. What matters is that I have everything documented. Every threat, every manipulation, every attempt to exploit me financially. Elder abuse is a crime in North Carolina, David. Multiple forms of it. Jennifer appeared behind him,
phone in hand. "This is insane. You can't just kick us out. We have nowhere to go. You have a condo in Charlotte. I suggest you return to it." "We sold it." Jennifer's voice went shrill. "We sold it because we were moving here permanently," David said. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. So it had gone even further than Margaret knew. They'd burned their own bridges, so certain she could be controlled. Robert Chen stepped into view from where he'd been waiting in the living room. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Robert Chen, your mother's attorney. You're trespassing. I suggest you leave now or I'll call the police." David's expression shifted through rage to calculation. "Fine. We'll go. But this isn't over, Mom. You're not competent to make these decisions. We'll petition the court." "With what evidence?" I kept my voice steady. "I have medical documentation of my competence. I have records of your financial exploitation and emotional abuse. I have a lawyer, an accountant, and witnesses to your threats. You have nothing but entitlement and debt." She watched her son struggle for words, saw the moment he realized he'd been outplayed. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired and infinitely sad. "I loved you," she said quietly. "I gave you everything. And you tried to steal the one thing I'd saved for myself? We're your family." David's voice cracked. "You're choosing a house over your own son? You chose your greed over your mother. Don't put this on me." The police arrived 10 minutes later. Robert had called them as a precaution. By 8 o'clock, David's family was gone. The storage pod hauled away, the house silent, except for the eternal sound of waves. Margaret stood on her deck, now truly alone, and breathed. The lawsuit came 3 weeks later. David petitioned for guardianship, claiming she was mentally incompetent and financially vulnerable. The court date was set for October. Margaret spent August preparing. Patricia Morales helped her organize every document, every bank statement, every piece of evidence of her financial stability and mental acuity. Robert Chen built a case that was, in his words, bulletproof. But Margaret did something else too, something David would never expect. She turned her 5-bedroom beach house into a business, not an Airbnb, though the irony wasn't lost on her. Instead, she established Seaside Writers Retreat, a month-long residency program for women over 50 who were working on creative projects. 4 bedrooms for residents, 1 for her. Application fee, monthly stipend, shared meals, writing workshops she would teach. The first session launched in September. 4 women arrived: a retired lawyer writing a legal thriller, a former nurse working on a memoir, a teacher writing poetry, and a widow crafting a historical novel. Margaret taught her what 40 years of teaching English had prepared her for. But more than that, she learned from them. Their resilience, their refusal to disappear just because society said their productive years were over. Their fierce determination to claim space for their own voices. When the court date arrived, Margaret brought 3 of them as character witnesses. They testified to her sharpness, her organizational skills, and her financial acumen in running the retreat. Dr. Morrison presented her evaluation. Patricia showed the court Margaret's meticulous financial records and her profitable business model. Robert Chen presented the evidence of David's exploitation attempts. The judge took 15 minutes to deliberate. "Petition denied," she said, looking directly at David over her glasses. "Mr. Harrison, your mother is clearly more than competent. In fact, she appears to be thriving. This court sees no grounds for guardianship and would caution you about making frivolous claims of incompetence against someone who has demonstrated such clear capability." David left the courthouse without looking at her. Margaret returned to her house on the beach, where her residents were waiting with champagne and cake. They celebrated into the evening, 4 women who understood what it meant to fight for space in a world that wanted them to shrink. 2 years later, Seaside Writers Retreat had a waiting list of 6 months. Margaret had published a guide for running creative residencies, which became a surprise bestseller among retirees looking for meaningful second acts. She'd been featured in Southern Living and the AARP magazine. David sent a Christmas card that year.
Inside, a brief note: "I hope you're doing well. The kids miss you." No apology, no acknowledgement of what he tried to do, just that small, barbed attempt to make her feel guilty for his own actions. Margaret considered responding. Then she set the card aside and returned to her morning routine. Coffee on the deck, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic, planning the workshops for her next group of residents. She'd learned something crucial in those terrible weeks when her son had tried to steal her peace. The world would always have people who saw others, especially older women, as resources to exploit, as obstacles to overcome, as problems to solve. The answer wasn't to accept it. The answer was to fight like hell. Her residents would arrive next week. 4 more women over 50, ready to claim their voices, their stories, their space. Margaret had their applications on her desk, had already started planning workshops tailored to their needs. The house that David had tried to take was filled with words now, with women's voices finally given room to breathe, with the kind of wealth that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with purpose. Margaret stood on her deck, salt air on her face, and smiled. This was her house, her life, her peace, and she'd fought for every bit of it. The waves rolled in, eternal and unstoppable, and Margaret, at 69, was just beginning. Sometimes the most radical act is refusing to disappear. Sometimes strength looks like an elderly woman with a good lawyer and the will to fight. Sometimes the family you build is more valuable than the family you were born into. This is about every person who's been told they're too old, too weak, too trusting to fight back. About everyone who's been exploited by those who should protect them. Damn right this is about you.
The House That Fought Back. Epilogue. The Price of Victory. The third winter came quietly. Margaret stood in her kitchen, watching snow fall over the Atlantic, a rare sight this far south. The weather had shut down the coastal highway, and her current residents were huddled in the living room with hot chocolate and laptops, grateful for the forced writing day. The email had arrived that morning. Not from David, she hadn't heard from him directly in 18 months, but from Jennifer. "Margaret, I'm writing because David won't. His company went bankrupt last month. We lost everything. The condo we moved into after Charlotte, the cars, everything. We're staying with my sister in a 2-bedroom apartment. The kids share a room the size of a closet. I'm not asking for money. I know you think we don't deserve it. Maybe we don't. But Mason asks about you sometimes. He's 10 now. He doesn't really remember what happened, just knows he had a grandmother he doesn't see anymore. David's pride won't let him say this, so I will. We were wrong. Not wrong in the small way of making mistakes. Wrong in the fundamental way of forgetting who you were, who you are. If you wanted revenge, you got it. We're destroyed. I hope it was worth it." Margaret read the email 3 times. Each time she felt something different. The first read brought a sharp, ugly satisfaction. The same feeling she'd had when the judge denied David's petition. They'd tried to destroy her, and instead destroyed themselves. The second read brought something more complex. She thought of Mason at 8, looking at her with such casual cruelty, parroting his parents' entitlement. She thought of him at 10, in a crowded apartment, watching his father's defeat. The third read brought the question she'd been avoiding for 2 years. What was victory, really? That evening, after her residents had retreated to their rooms, Margaret sat on her deck, despite the cold. The snow had stopped, leaving the beach transformed, white and pristine under a moon that turned everything silver. She thought about David as a child, not the manipulative man who'd tried to steal her house, but the boy who cried when his goldfish died, who'd made her birthday cards with painstaking crayon letters, who'd told her she was the best mom in the world. That boy had grown into a man who saw his mother as an asset to liquidate. When had it happened? Was it gradual? Years of business school and corporate culture teaching him that everything had a price, everyone was negotiable? Or was there some fundamental flaw she'd missed, some failure in how she'd raised him? The self-blame came easily. 40 years of teaching had taught her that. Every student who failed, every troubled kid who fell through the cracks, Hadn't she always wondered what she could have done differently? But then she thought of the women in her house. 3 of them were mothers. 2 had adult children who treated them with respect and love. 1 had a daughter who called every Sunday without fail. The difference wasn't in the parenting. The difference was in the children's choices. David had chosen greed over gratitude, entitlement over empathy. That wasn't her failure. That was his. Still, Jennifer's words echoed. If you wanted revenge, you got it. Was that what this was? Revenge? Margaret didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at her desk and wrote, not a response to Jennifer, not yet, but a document she'd been avoiding for 2 years. It was a letter to David, the real one. Not the legal declarations Robert had drafted, not the careful boundaries she'd established, but the raw truth of what his betrayal had cost her. You were my son, my only child. I held you when you were born and thought my heart would crack open from loving you. I worked doubles at the diner to pay for your college. I drove 6 hours to watch your graduation. I believed in you when you started your company, even though I didn't understand half of what you were trying to build. And when I bought this house, with my money, my savings, my sister's inheritance that she left to me, you saw it as something you deserved. You didn't see a mother who'd finally claimed something for herself after a lifetime of giving. You saw a resource to exploit. Do you know what that did to me? Not the legal battle, not even the threats. It was the moment I realized you'd forgotten I was human, that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being your mother and become an obstacle between you and what you wanted. Jennifer says I got my revenge. She's wrong. I didn't want revenge. I wanted my house, my peace, my right to exist as something other than your retirement plan. But here's what I've learned in these 2 years. Victory isn't the same as healing. I won, the house is mine, my business thrives, I'm happy in ways I never was before. And I miss my son every single day. Not the man who tried to steal from me, the boy who used to be. Maybe that going never existed. Maybe I created him in my memory, softening the edges, forgetting the early signs of what you'd become. Or maybe you killed him yourself, trading him for stock options and strategic thinking and the belief that wealth was the only measure of worth. I don't know how to forgive you. I don't know if I should. But I do know this. I'm tired of being angry. The anger kept me strong when I needed to fight. But now it's just heavy. You destroyed yourself. I didn't do that. Your choices did. And I can't save you from the consequences any more than I could prevent you from making those choices in the first place. I hope someday you understand what you lost. Not the house, not the money you thought you'd get from it, but the relationship with someone who loved you unconditionally until you proved that love had a price you weren't willing to pay. She read the letter 3 times. Then she saved it in a folder on her computer, titled Unsent. Maybe someday she'd send it. Maybe she wouldn't. But writing it had done something the court victory never had. It had given her permission to grieve. 3 days later, Margaret called Jennifer. I got your email, she said when Jennifer answered. Silence. Then, I shouldn't have sent it. David doesn't know I did. He'd be furious. I'm not giving you money. I told you I wasn't asking. But I want to see Mason and Olivia, if they want to see me. More silence. Margaret could hear a television in the background, children's voices arguing about something inconsequential. Why? Jennifer's voice was guarded. Because they're 10 years old, and what happened between their father and me shouldn't cost them a grandmother, not if they actually want one. David won't like it. David doesn't have to like it. This isn't about him. It's about whether those kids want a relationship with me and whether I can have one with them without enabling the behavior that destroyed us in the first place. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Can I ask you something? Do you think we were always like this?
greedy and entitled? Or did something change us? Margaret considered the question carefully. I think you got lost, both of you. You started measuring worth in dollars and stopped measuring it in dignity. And when the money got tight, you looked for the easiest solution instead of the right one. We thought we were being practical, strategic. You thought you were entitled to something that wasn't yours. There's a difference. I know that now. Jennifer's voice cracked. We lost everything, Margaret. Everything. And the worst part is knowing we did it to ourselves. Then maybe you learned something valuable. Maybe your children will grow up understanding that character matters more than bank accounts. Or maybe they'll grow up resenting us for failing. Maybe. But that's not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to decide what kind of person I want to be. And I want to be someone who doesn't punish children for their parents' mistakes. Mason and Olivia visited in April, brought by Jennifer during David's business trip to Atlanta. He was trying to rebuild, Jennifer explained. New company, new approach. She didn't say whether he was succeeding. The children were different, quieter, more careful with things. Mason helped her clear the breakfast dishes without being asked. Olivia thanked her for letting them visit. Do you hate Dad? Mason asked her on the second day, the question coming sudden and sharp while they walked the beach. Margaret stopped walking, looked at this boy who was becoming someone new, shaped by circumstances he hadn't chosen. No, she said, truthfully. I hate what he did, but hate is too heavy to carry forever. He says you stole his inheritance. I didn't. I used my own money to buy my own house, but I understand why he'd tell you that. It's easier than admitting the truth. What's the truth? That he tried to take something that wasn't his, and I fought back. And now we're all living with the consequences. Mason was quiet for a long time, watching waves collapse into foam. Mom cries sometimes. Late at night, she thinks we don't hear. Margaret's heart twisted. Losing everything is hard. Did you want us to lose everything? The real question. The one she'd been asking herself. No, she said. I wanted my house back. Your father's choices, the business decisions, the debt, all of that. Those consequences were his own making. I didn't cause them. I just refused to be his solution. He says you're selfish. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just finally putting myself first after a lifetime of putting others ahead of me. I don't know the difference anymore. They walked in silence. Then Mason said, small-voiced, I'm glad we came. I missed you. Margaret took his hand. This boy who'd been taught to despise her, who was now learning to think for himself. I miss you too. They left after 3 days. Margaret stood on her porch, watching Jennifer's car disappear down the coastal highway. Inside, her residents were working on their projects. Outside, the Atlantic rolled eternal. Victory, she thought, wasn't simple. It wasn't the courtroom triumph or the successful business or even the recovered peace. Victory was this, the ability to hold both grief and joy, to acknowledge damage while refusing to be destroyed by it, to set boundaries without building walls so high nothing could reach her. She'd won her house. She'd lost her son, at least the version of him she'd wanted him to be. She'd gained a purpose, a community, a life that was entirely hers. And she'd learned that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was fight, and sometimes it was forgive. And sometimes it was simply survive, with your dignity intact. The waves whispered their eternal wisdom. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Margaret turned and walked back into her house, her sanctuary, her battlefield, her home. This was her life now. Complicated, scarred, but undeniably, irrevocably hers. And that, finally, was enough.